All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're gonna try to tackle something pretty fundamental, something that everyone deals with, whether you're leading a team or uh, running a business or just navigating the world out there, and that's ensuring satisfaction. We all have those moments when maybe expectations aren't met or things go a little bit wrong, and so how do we turn those moments around?
Yeah, it really is all about those critical junctures, when things could go either way. And what's interesting is we're going to look through a pretty fascinating lens today to understand how to do this really well. We're going to look at the interview questions that are used to identify top talent in guest relations. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, guest relations, why do I care about hotel interview questions? But really the brilliance of these questions is that they reveal the underlying skills. They kind of dissect the core skill set needed to navigate these tricky situations, to build positive connections with people, skills that honestly are invaluable across countless areas of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've pulled together a really great set of questions. And what I found particularly insightful is how they're structured. So we're going to look at a couple of different categories. First, we're going to dive into those situational scenarios, those what would you do kind of puzzles. Then we're going to talk about some essential soft skills. Then we'll move into some more strategic, what we call role-specific interview questions. And finally, we'll get to the famous STAR method, which really helps us understand how people have actually handled these challenges in the past. So I think it's a really comprehensive way to get at what makes someone truly, truly adept at this whole area of ensuring satisfaction.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating is how these situational questions, they cut to the heart of someone's approach to problem solving right away.
Hmm.
So for instance, right out the gate, let's say a guest reports that, their room isn't clean even though, it was just serviced.
Yeah.
What would be that crucial first step? And maybe even more importantly, what's the underlying principle at play?
Right. And, the first thing I want to jump in and say is, well, but they just cleaned it. It's like that's the first thing that comes to mind, at least for me.
And that's the trap, because the immediate reaction needs to be laser focused on the guest's experience,
Yeah.
right? Their perception is their reality in that moment. So the first step isn't to argue or to explain, but really to investigate directly,
Yeah.
from their perspective. Okay, well, what are you seeing or experiencing that signals to you that it's not clean? Is it a missed spot, a lingering odor?
Right. And really what we're talking about here is detaching from your kind of operational standpoint. The fact that, a process should have resulted in a clean room is irrelevant to the guest's current discomfort. It's all about, the primacy of their perception in these service interactions. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You have to start by validating that experience. Okay, so here's a scenario that I think a lot of people have either experienced or can at least imagine. A guest needs a replacement key card, but there's a long line at the reception desk for, people checking in. How do you manage that without frustrating either the guest with the immediate need or those in line who are patiently waiting?
Well, it's really tests someone's ability to manage these competing priorities, right? In these very guest-facing environments. So the guest who can't access their room, clearly they have an urgent need. So, a skilled approach here involves acknowledging those who are waiting, even just a quick, "Excuse me, everyone, I just need to assist this guest with a quick issue, and I'll be right back to continue check-in." Something like that can go a long way. And then swiftly addressing that lost keycard, ideally even at a separate point if possible, so you're not further, bottlenecking the line. It's really about demonstrating this awareness of everyone's time and needs, even as you're addressing, one particular immediate crisis.
It's a real delicate balance of efficiency and empathy. Okay. Now imagine this. A guest makes a specific dietary request after the kitchen has already prepped all the meals for the day. So it seems like you've got this clash between kind of operational efficiency, like we've already made all the food, and then this individual need. So how would someone successfully navigate that?
This one really highlights the importance of resourceful communication. The first step, calm, clear relay of the request back to the kitchen. Now, even if standard dishes are set, are there adaptable elements or alternative ingredients readily available? The key here is to explore all the possibilities,
Yeah.
right, for some degree of accommodation. And if a completely custom meal just isn't feasible at that point, then a transparent explanation to the guest, coupled with sincere, alternative suggestions, even if they're simpler, demonstrates that you're genuinely making an effort,
Right.
right, to accommodate them. It's that willingness to try to find find a bridge, even if the ideal solution just isn't possible.
Right, yeah, it's about showing that you're trying, even if you can't perform a miracle in the kitchen. Okay, here's a classic, I think hotel headache. A noise complaint in a fully booked hotel on a weekend. So you've got to help one guest without impacting the experience of, potentially dozens of others.
This one demands a tactful and discreet investigative approach,
Mhm.
right? So first of all, gathering specifics from the guest who's complaining. What is the source of the noise? What type of noise is it? When is it occurring? Then, discreet investigation, perhaps a quiet check with the neighboring rooms, a staff member observing the area. The resolution, again, could range from a polite request to lower the volume to, maybe more firm action if it's really necessary, but always balancing, right, the needs of the complaining guests with the rights and the experiences of everyone else who's in this full house.
Right, yeah. It's a real high wire act of diplomacy there. Okay, last situational question. This one I think a lot of us have either experienced or can at least relate to. A guest loses their passport or some other really critical document. I mean, that's just panic-inducing for anyone. So how can the staff best support them in a moment like that?
In those moments where there's so much stress,
Yeah.
empathy and practical guidance, I think those are paramount. So the immediate response, right, it should be reassuring,
Yeah.
offering, concrete assistance. And that includes, helping them contact the right authorities, providing, phone numbers or even internet access, offering, clear information on how to report lost documents, even leveraging, the resources that the hotel has. Do they need printing? Do they need computer access? Depending on the context, even just offering that emotional support and that practical help, like directions to an embassy, assistance with local transportation, all of this can really transform what could be a complete disaster into a much more manageable situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about being that kind of that beacon of help in that moment of crisis. Okay, so let's switch gears now. Let's move into the world of soft skills, and these are those essential interpersonal abilities. And top of the list here, going above and beyond for a guest. Why is this considered such a strong indicator of excellence in guest relations?
Well, I think what's insightful about going above and beyond is it doesn't have to be these grand gestures, right? It's often these small, proactive acts of thoughtfulness that really demonstrate that initiative, that genuine sense of empathy and a desire to really make the guest's experience special. When someone anticipates a need that the guest hasn't even voiced, or they find a creative solution to some minor hiccup, it fosters this really powerful emotional connection and it builds that lasting loyalty. Think of it as creating these moments of surprise and delight.
Yeah, those little unexpected things, that's what people remember. All right, so now how about this? How about handling difficult guests while maintaining a positive attitude? I mean, that sounds like a real test of resilience there. So what are some of the key strategies for doing this well?
Yeah, maintaining that positivity, especially when you're facing a guest who, is maybe uh, not in the best mood, that's really fundamental to de-escalation and ultimately to finding a resolution. So the key strategies here really revolve around active listening, truly focusing on understanding their concerns without interruption, demonstrating that empathy for their frustration, and then crucially, remaining calm and professional even if the guest's demeanor is not. It's also about shifting the focus from, assigning blame to actually trying to find solution.
Mhm.
Oftentimes a guest just wants to feel heard, and acknowledged. And a calm, positive approach can be remarkably effective in diffusing that tension.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no one likes to be met with defensiveness. That just makes things worse. Okay, what about this? What about navigating language or cultural barriers? How do you, bridge those communication gaps effectively when you've got people from different backgrounds?
I think this requires a real blend of resourcefulness and genuine cultural sensitivity.
Mm.
So utilizing translation tools or even, seeking assistance from staff who are multilingual, those are great practical first steps. But equally important is demonstrating that patience, speaking clearly at a moderate pace, maybe employing some visual aids or gestures where it's appropriate. Even just showing a genuine effort to understand and respect the guest's background. Even if you don't have perfect verbal communication, that can go such a long way in building rapport and facilitating, an actual resolution.
Yeah, it's about finding those creative ways to connect and understand beyond just the words themselves. Okay, handling complaints and concerns. This is, really at the heart of guest relations. So what does an effective approach to this actually look like?
A structured and empathetic approach, I think that tends to be the most effective. So this typically involves,
Active listening.
right, to fully grasp the complaint, acknowledging the guest's emotions, offering a sincere apology for the inconvenience, regardless of who's at fault, then conducting a thorough investigation, proposing a fair solution, and crucially following up to make sure that the guest is actually satisfied with the outcome. Taking ownership of the issue, even if it means you've got to coordinate with other departments, that demonstrates a real commitment to resolving that concern.
Yes, that follow-up, it shows you're really invested in making sure they have a good experience. Okay, final one under soft skills, prioritizing and managing workload while still delivering that exceptional guest service. I mean, how do you juggle all of that? How do you do it all at the same time?
It's a constant balancing act,
Mhm.
right? And it requires strong organizational skills, the ability to prioritize tasks based on their urgency and their impact on the guest experience, and of course, effective time management techniques. However, I think the most important thing to remember here is that efficiency should never come at the expense of that genuine human interaction. So, empowering staff to handle some of those routine requests efficiently frees up time to address those more complex guest needs and to really provide that personalized touch. It's about working strategically, not frantically.
Right. Yeah. It's about having those systems in place so that you're not or not always just in that reactive mode. Okay. So let's move on to the role specific interview questions, and these really start to get at the more strategic thinking required in a role like guest relations manager. So first, handling dissatisfied guests. Now we touched on this a little bit when we were talking about soft skills, but what's that deeper role specific perspective here?
Yeah, from a role-specific standpoint, you're really exploring the strategies and tools that a candidate would employ. So, does this person have knowledge of different service recovery frameworks? Do they understand when and how to offer compensation, like upgrades, discounts, complimentary services? It also assesses their ability to de-escalate those high-emotion situations, to find those mutually acceptable resolutions within, of course, the boundaries of company policy, and ultimately empower their team, right, to effectively address guest dissatisfaction, even at their level.
Right. So it's about having a toolkit of solutions and knowing when to apply which one. All right, here's a key question that comes up a lot in these interviews. Describe a successful strategy you implemented to improve guest satisfaction ratings. So, what are the interviewers really trying to uncover with a question like that?
That question is all about impact. Interviewers want to see, can this person actually identify areas for improvement, then develop and execute a strategic plan, and then measure the results? A strong answer here is going to include a specific problem that they identified, maybe through, feedback analysis, the concrete strategy that they implemented, whether it was a new staff training program focused on empathy, a change in a specific service procedure, a new feedback mechanism, how they track the impact,
Yeah.
mentioning those specific metrics, and then those positive outcomes, those achievements, ideally with, quantifiable data to support their claims.
Yeah. I think that's super important. You need that data to back up your claims. Okay, so how do you ensure those consistently high levels of guest service, even during those peak periods when everyone is just slammed and the pressure's on?
I think maintaining that quality, especially when you're super busy, requires a really proactive approach. And it has to be focused on meticulous planning and thorough preparation. So, making sure you've got adequate staffing levels, streamlining processes to maximize efficiency, establishing clear, effective communication channels among the staff, empowering team members to handle those common guest issues independently, anticipating those potential bottlenecks, having those contingency plans, right, already in place, regular training on how to manage these high-pressure situations, and just constantly reinforcing that positive service mindset. Even when you're rushed off your feet, all of that's essential to deliver consistently good service.
So it's about building those resilient systems and having a team that's ready for anything. All right. What about gathering and analyzing guest feedback to drive those ongoing improvements? How does a good guest relations manager, how do they approach this?
A truly effective guest relations manager, they view feedback as pure gold. They see it as this invaluable intelligence that helps them constantly improve. So this involves actively soliciting feedback through all kinds of channels, comment cards, online review platforms, direct interactions, and then crucially establishing this robust system for actually analyzing that feedback to find those recurring trends, to pinpoint the areas of concern, and then translate those insights into concrete strategies that actually enhance the overall guest experience. This might lead to adjustments in service protocols, maybe policy revisions, targeted staff training. It's all about using that feedback effectively.
Right. It's this continuous loop of listening, learning, adapting.
Okay, final question in this category. How does a guest relations manager stay competitive? How do they keep abreast of all the latest trends in the industry to make sure that the experience they're providing remains innovative, remains, at the cutting edge?
Well, in today's world where things are constantly changing, continuous learning is just absolute paramount. So, this involves actively engaging with industry publications, attending those relevant conferences and webinars, participating in professional networks to share ideas with your peers, and just generally staying informed about those emerging technologies and those service innovations that have the potential to really elevate the guest experience. It's about bringing that forward thinking, that adaptable mindset to the role. All right, so let's dive into the STAR interview questions now. So this structured approach, it's really designed to uncover those past behaviors, those past experiences, those past successes. So, first example, a time when a guest experience fell short of their expectations. So, walk us through, how would someone answer this well using the STAR framework?
Okay, so let's say we've got, we use that STAR framework situation. A guest specifically booked a room with a high floor city view, and this was confirmed at booking. However, upon arrival, they were assigned a lower floor room overlooking the service entrance. It may be due to some unforeseen maintenance issue with the higher floors. All right, so the task. The immediate task, of course, is to acknowledge that disappointment and to find a suitable resolution to regain their satisfaction. Action. So the candidate should describe how they approach the guest with empathy. They actively listen to that frustration. They sincerely apologize for the discrepancy, and then they start proactively exploring all the available alternatives. So this might have involved checking for any other rooms with a similar view, offering a complimentary upgrade to a different room category with a better view. And if no suitable room was available, maybe offering a significant discount on their current stay, along with some complimentary amenity, maybe a meal or a spa treatment, just to compensate for that unmet expectation. And then result. While the initial disappointment was completely understandable, the guest appreciated that sincere apology and those proactive steps that were taken to really try to address the issue. And they ultimately left with a positive impression of the hotel's commitment to service recovery. And, who knows, maybe they even came back for another visit and left a nice review online. So it's really about highlighting those specific actions and that positive turnaround that you were able to achieve.
Right. Yeah. Showing that, that you were able to make things right, even though there was that initial setback. Okay. Makes perfect sense. Next star example, going above and beyond for a guest with an unusual request. So what kind of situation and action would really showcase this skill?
Okay, so let's say the situation is a guest contacts the hotel concierge before they even arrive, and they explain that they're planning a surprise proposal in their room. And they have this very specific request. They want this particular rare orchid, which is not easy to find in the local area. They want that to be the centerpiece of the room decor. So the task here, of course, is to fulfill this highly personalized and pretty unusual request and really ensure that it's a special, a truly memorable occasion for this guest. Action. So here, the candidate should detail the steps they took. Maybe this involved extensive research to actually locate a supplier of that specific orchid, maybe contacting florists in other cities, arranging for a special overnight delivery, coordinating with housekeeping to make sure that orchid was beautifully displayed in the room before the guest even arrived. Really emphasizing that extra effort, that creativity, that resourcefulness that was required to fulfill this very unique request. And then result. The guest is, of course, absolutely thrilled, deeply touched by this very personalized effort. And it all leads to a successful proposal and a glowing review, specifically mentioning that exceptional service that made their special occasion truly unforgettable.
Right. Yeah, that kind of personalized touch. That's what really creates those loyal, those super fans. Okay, so now let's do a star scenario where we're talking about handling a difficult guest. So difficult, or maybe even a confrontational guest. How would a strong response demonstrate those essential skills?
Okay, situation. A guest becomes very agitated, very confrontational at the front desk. It's all about a billing charge that they're disputing, and they're raising their voice, and it's creating this really tense atmosphere in the lobby. So the task here, primarily, is to de-escalate that situation, to understand the root of the billing discrepancy, to find a resolution, but all while maintaining a calm and professional environment for the other guests and still aiming for a positive outcome with that upset guest. Action. So here the candidate would describe how they approach the guest, very calmly, very respectfully. Maybe they even suggest, hey, why don't we step over to a more private area so we can discuss this without disturbing the other guests. They would really emphasize that active listening to the guest's concerns, patiently and clearly explaining those billing details, exploring all the possible solutions, all the possible compromises within, of course, the boundaries of the hotel policy. And they would also highlight their ability to stay composed, right? Even though the guest is maybe not behaving in the most appropriate manner, they don't want to escalate the situation. They wanted to stay focused on finding that solution. And then the result, hopefully, the billing issue is resolved to the guest's satisfaction, or at least a reasonable compromise is reached. The guest's, agitation subsides. The situation is handled without negatively impacting, all the other guests in the lobby. So everyone wins.
Right. It's about staying cool under pressure and really prioritizing that resolution. Okay. Next star example, planning and executing a really successful event or promotion. So what are the key aspects that a candidate should highlight in their response here?
Okay, so let's say the situation is the hotel is looking to boost their midweek occupancy, during what's traditionally a slow season. And so they tasked this candidate with planning and executing a themed promotional package that's going to specifically target local residents. So the task here is to create this engaging and attractive experience that's going to resonate with that target audience, align with the hotel's brand, and ultimately drive increased bookings and revenue during that slower period. So the agitation. The candidate should really explain the entire process from A to Z. The initial brainstorming and market research to identify those appealing themes. Maybe they find some cool local partnerships. They talk about the logistical planning, developing all the package inclusions, the marketing and the promotional strategies across different channels, the coordination with different hotel departments, any external vendors, and then, of course, the actual execution of that promotional period. They should really emphasize their initiative, their attention to detail, and any challenges that they overcame along the way. And then finally, the result. Highlight those positive outcomes. Did they see a big increase in those midweek occupancy rates? Did they get positive guest feedback on the event, on the package? Did it lead to increased brand awareness, local goodwill? Those quantifiable results and specific examples, those are key.
Right. It shows that, strategic thinking and the ability to actually deliver results.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. Let's talk about the STAR method as applied to resolving a conflict between a guest and a member of the staff. So this requires a lot of diplomacy.
It really does. So let's say the situation is a guest has a misunderstanding with, let's say, a member of the front desk staff, and it's regarding the hotel's pet policy. And it's led to some frustration. It's led to a real breakdown in communication. So the task here is to mediate that conflict effectively, to ensure guest satisfaction, but also to support that staff member and uphold, those hotel policies. Action. So the candidate should describe how they approach both the guest and the staff member, maybe even separately, to gain a really clear understanding of each perspective, utilizing that active listening, that empathy. Maybe they facilitated a calm, private conversation between the two to clarify the pet policy, to address the guest's specific concerns, to make sure that the staff member felt heard and respected. They would emphasize their role in finding that mutually agreeable solution that satisfied the guest, within the bounds of the hotel policy. And also maybe they reinforce those clear communication protocols with the staff member. And then the result, the conflict is hopefully resolved amicably, the guest concerns are addressed. The staff member feels supported, feels understood, and that overall morale, is maintained. It prevents any lingering negative impact on the guest stay or, on future staff performance.
Right. It's about finding that balance that respects everyone involved and also upholds those standards. So this deep dive into these interview questions, it's really provided, I think, a valuable framework for you for thinking about all of this. So as we kind of look back at this conversation, what are those absolute core principles that stand out to you in terms of achieving that real excellence in guest relations and honestly just in dealing with people in general?
The takeaways here, I think they're multifaceted. So first, that proactive mindset, right? Focused on anticipating and preventing issues before they even arise. That's key. Secondly, empathetic communication, truly understanding and validating the guest's perspective. And then third, the importance of going the extra mile, those thoughtful touches. Those are what create those memorable experiences.
And then we also talked about the value of structured problem solving, like we saw with that STAR method. And that's for really learning from past experiences and articulating those effective approaches. And then finally, that commitment to continuous improvement, driven by actively seeking and analyzing guest feedback. So all of that is essential for long-term success. And I think what's important to remember is while we've explored this through the lens of guest relations, these principles, this idea of empathy, proactive problem solving, a focus on positive interactions, those are really universal. Those apply to any situation where you're dealing with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're reflecting on this deep dive, think about this. Think about a situation in your own life, in your own work, where you faced a guest relations challenge. Maybe it was managing a difficult client, maybe navigating a disagreement with a colleague, or even just trying to ensure a positive experience for someone you were interacting with. How might the principles that we unpacked today, how might those offer a new way of looking at that situation, or even suggest a different approach? What kind of small intentional steps could you take to proactively enhance satisfaction in your interactions moving forward? It's all about making those connections more positive and ultimately more effective. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.